You have to not be intimidated by the anger, and you have to not be swamped by compassion about the tears. And then you can have a conversation. And people don't do that. They won't do that.
Jordan Peterson's insight is invaluable. Anger and compassion are two sides of the same sword, and to have a genuine conversation, you gotta let go of both. It takes true mastery to navigate complex emotions and engage with others authentically. Let Jordan Peterson guide you on the path to becoming a master at dealing with people's emotions, and watch your relationships flourish.
When there's tension in a household and multiple systems of value operating simultaneously, there's a tremendous confusion about what should reign supreme, right? And you think, well, nothing has to reign supreme. We can all have our diverse opinions. No, you can't.
Jordan Peterson's message is clear. Don't be a sheep that mirrors itself in others. Instead, have your own opinions. Don't let people make decisions for you. It takes courage to stand up for what you believe in, and Jordan is here to remind us of that. So let Jordan Peterson inspire you to break free from the herd and embrace your true self.
And so they don't solve the problems, and so then the problems accrue, right? And if they accrue over 15 years of a relationship, then they end up fat, ugly, and in divorce court. For example, let's say there's something going on at your workplace and you need to object to it because it's driving you crazy. And you talk it over with your wife so that you've got your head screwed on straight. You say, oh, I've got to say something. And you go there and you say something and you're stumbling and awkward and all of that. But you watch the response and maybe you get what you're aiming at, maybe you don't. But you've learned a bunch. You've learned, well, I'm not as coherent as I could be. I'm not as good at putting my arguments together. My boss is more of a son of a bitch than he thought he was. This is a worse problem than I knew about. It's like differentiated. So now the landscape is higher resolution, and so are you. Well, so good. So maybe you're a little bit better prepared the next time you have to do that. And so the issue here, to some degree, is don't lose an opportunity to grapple with something that objects to you, especially when the objection is rather small. Because that's something you say, well, I can put up with it. It's like, fair enough, like you don't want to make everything into a war. I usually use a rule of 3. If we're interacting and you do something that I find disruptive, I'll note it. And then if you do it again, I think, oh yeah, that probably wasn't merely situational, but I'll leave it be because that's still not enough evidence. But if you do it a third time, then I'll say, hey, I just noticed this. And you'll say, no, that didn't happen. And I'll say, yeah, not only did it happen, but it happened here and it happened here, and I'm not making this up. So there's something going on here, like I'm not ignoring it, and we can get to the bottom of it. And then they'll come up with a bunch of objections about why that isn't necessary, and you push those aside, and they'll come up with a few more objections, and they'll push those aside, and then usually they'll get mad or burst into tears, and if you push that aside, then you get to have a conversation.
Jordan Peterson understands the key to unlocking healthy relationships, taking responsibility for our own emotions and actions. By looking inward and owning our part of the relationship dynamic, we can resolve conflicts and foster deeper connections. This insight can save countless marriages and transform our love lives, allowing us to build stronger bonds with our significant others. So take a deep dive into your emotional landscape with Jordan's guidance. You'll wonder why you didn't discover this transformative video sooner.
But man, you gotta be a monster, because first of all, you need 6 arguments about why their objections aren't gonna stop you. And then you have to not be intimidated by the anger, and you have to not be swamped by compassion about the tears. And then you can have a conversation. And people don't do that. They won't do that. And so they don't solve the problems, and so then the problems accrue, right? And if they accrue over 15 years of a relationship, then they end up fat, ugly, and in divorce court. The next time you find yourself embroiled in an argument with someone that's contentious and uncomfortable, say, institute the following rule. You don't get to respond to the person's claims until they've exhausted that particular claim, and this does presume to some degree that you're dealing with a good faith actor, even if they feel differently than you do. You don't get to respond until you have recapitulated their viewpoint and summarized it in a manner they find acceptable. That's so treacherously sneaky, that rule, because what it means is you have to demonstrate that you attended to what they say closely enough and carefully enough to, first of all, act out validation of the idea that they have an opinion worth attending to. So that's a big deal, eh? People really like being paid attention to. There's nothing people like more than that, unless they have something to hide. And even then, there's a part of them that would rather have that paid attention to than fail to pass, to go unnoticed. Every cynic is entirely disappointed when his or her cynicism goes unchallenged, because there's a part of them, like a little unwarped part of their soul, that's still alive, thinking, oh my God, I hope someone calls me on all my foolishness and cynicism, because if they don't, that means that it's valid and generally applicable, and I'm in hell, and what good is that? So you're called upon to, first of all, summarize what they said, which is not an easy thing, right? Because it means you have to, and sometimes it's somewhat incoherent and emotion-laden, especially if it's in the course of an argument. So you have to sort of strike right to the quick. It sounds to me like this is the point you were making, and then you lay out the point, and then you see they have to be happy with your summary. They have to be pleased with it, which means that you're doing exactly the opposite of straw-manning the argument, quite the contrary, and you're doing them a favor in some sense by reducing it to the gist, because that's actually an incredibly complex cognitive operation. Now, we talked a lot about the hierarchical structure of goals, and so here's something to think about. So the thing that announces itself as error has a twofold nature. That's because it's chaos and order at the same time. Or it's because it's all the archetypal structures at the same time. It's the dragon of chaos, it's the great mother, positive and negative, it's the great father, positive and negative, it's the individual, hero and adversary. All of that manifests itself in the moment of error, right? The archetypes come forward. Did you make an error because you're a bad person? Could be. I had one client who was extraordinarily seriously affected, but she told me she went on a tangent that lasted for 4 consecutive day clinical sessions. Like, they weren't the whole day, but they were 50 minutes on 4 consecutive days. I had no idea where she was going. She was wandering all over in this Freudian associational manner, and she came to the point at the end of it. It was unbelievable. She tied together this, she was a very intelligent woman, she tied together this tremendously long, incoherent ramble into a little bow right at the end, like the punchline of a remarkable joke. And she had extracted, in some sense, the gist of what she was saying as a consequence of the circumambulation, the wandering through all this territory. And when you listen to someone very, very carefully, and especially if they express themselves for a while, and you say to them, well, it sounds to me like this is what you're saying, what you're doing is taking a tremendous amount of emotionally laden material, a lot of it unnecessary in the final analysis because of the ensuing synthesis, and offering them a synthesis, which is a great thing to do, especially if they're happy to accept it, because that also means that you did listen to them. So you signified that they were worth attending to, and then you listened to them enough to actually understand what they were saying, to try to understand it, and then you did understand it. And then they're way happier with you, even if you're arguing with them, because at least now they know they can rely on you to be a reliable listener, and that you're not trying to, you know how it is when you're arguing with someone, there's a part of you that really wants to win. It's like, I'm right, you're stupid and wrong. If you do that, of course, well, that's not a great road to peace unless you're willing to bring a big club to the argument, and many people are, and instead of listening and trying to make peace and sort things out, they'll use all sorts of subtle forms of suppression in their ensuing dialogue just to keep everything, you know, under the rug or in the closet. I wouldn't recommend that as a medium to long-term strategy, especially if you're trying to bring peace to a household. You have to go through this horribly painful process of listening to the people around you tell you what they think of their lives. And if you do that, then, well, maybe you can all come to a place that is characterized by something approximating genuine peace. And I would say that even psychophysiologically, you know, I mean, when there's tension in a household and multiple systems of value operating simultaneously, there's a tremendous confusion about what should reign supreme, right? And you think, well, nothing has to reign supreme. We can all have our diverse opinions. No, you can't. Not if you're going to live together in harmony. There has to be some overarching structure that unites you. What else is a family if it's not an overarching structure that unites you? Now, within that, there can be tolerance and even appreciation for necessary individual differences, and obviously there should be, but that doesn't mean there's not a higher unity that the entire organization, let's say, is striving for in some manner, and not only striving for, but pining for, or even dying for. And I don't use those words lightly. Like, the absence of that incorporating higher structure is a felt sense of catastrophe on the part of the members of the family. They're always at each other's throats. They're interfering with each other's goals. They can't listen. They're in a chronic state of hyper-arousal because they don't know what to do ever. So this isn't some, what would you say, humanity's myth or some reality that isn't as concrete as everything that you see before you. It's quite the contrary. Well, you had to let people talk to find out what they thought, so they could find out what they thought, so they could move towards something, so they could move away from hell, because that's certainly what you see in clinical practice. I mean, people are suffering in ways you can you can probably imagine, because no doubt many of you have either been there or seen people who were there, lived with them. If pain is more real than anything else, what's even more real than pain is whatever we have to fight off the pain. And that's free speech. It's identical with freedom of thought. It's associated with this capacity and necessity to listen deeply. They're flip sides of the same coin, to use a terrible cliche. And all the clinical data we have, including the more stringently research-oriented clinical inquiry, indicates quite clearly that the exchange of information like that, the generation of semantic and emotional information in a state of relative freedom, the revelation of those thoughts, and then the discursive analysis of those thoughts, say, and then the implementation into action and the testing of them, that is the pathway to health, insofar as that can be attained by, say, psychological or spiritual means. And so that's why free speech is not just another freedom or right among many. It's certainly not viewpoint diversity or anything like that. It's the mechanism by which we generate the conceptions that allow us to organize our experience in the world. And more than that, it's the mechanism that allows us to reformulate and criticize those conceptions when they've become outdated and sterile, to dissolve them into a chaos that we have to contend with while it's occurring, and then to reanimate them in a new form so that we can move into the future.